To understand 20th century French philosophy, you have to begin with a rupture, the premise that human consciousness shatters its connection to the inert material world. Objects are what they are, but human beings are a void, separated from the physical universe. This portrait shows Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher who built an entire system around this separation. He argued that for human beings, existence precedes essence. We arrive in the world first, without a pre-existing blueprint, and only later define who we are. Sartre called this state of being the pour soi, or the for itself. It dictates that consciousness is essentially empty. You have no innate human nature, no predestined path, and no core controlling your actions. You are an absolute lack of predefined identity. Because you lack a predefined essence, you are condemned to be free. You operate as a vortex of indeterminacy. Every choice you make, every action you take, generates your meaning from scratch. You cannot blame your upbringing or your circumstances. You are entirely responsible for what you become. In this framework, the autonomous, conscious individual sits at the undisputed center of reality. The human subject acts as the sole origin point of all values, generating the meaning of the world simply by existing in it. This photograph captures Michel Foucault. Coming of age in an intellectual climate dominated by Sartre, he dedicated his career to dismantling this philosophy of consciousness. Foucault argued that the autonomous, freely choosing individual does not actually exist. The self that Sartre placed at the center of the universe is a historical illusion, a product manufactured by external systems of power. Foucault saw that Sartre had simply taken God out of the center of reality and dropped the man-subject in his place. By treating the individual as the starting point, existentialism ignores the invisible networks of language, culture, and institutions that actually produce a person's identity. He called this the anonymous system. Power isn't a weapon wielded by a single dictator. It operates as a decentralized web of institutions and discourses. It is the structure itself that does the thinking and shaping, constraining what is even possible for a person to conceive. Therefore, the philosophical task is no longer to explore an imaginary human nature. The task is to trace the historical forces that manufactured the very concept of the individual subject in the first place. To trace these forces, Foucault didn't look at abstract metaphysics. He analyzed the history of the human sciences, disciplines like sociology, psychology, and medicine. He identified that prior to the 19th century, during what he called the classical period, man was not an object of scientific study. The systems of knowledge were concerned with classifying nature and wealth, but the human being as a sovereign subject of knowledge had no place in the equation. Then, the 19th century saw an explosion of the human sciences. Suddenly, human behavior, desires, and biology were turned into data points to be measured, categorized, and treated. The consequence is that the individual is not an elementary nucleus that science eventually discovered. The individual is an effect generated exactly where these new scientific discourses intersect. The feeling of possessing a deep, natural self is a highly specific, recent invention, constructed by the academic and institutional frameworks of the last 200 years. This historical blueprint shows the floor plan of an early psychiatric asylum, a key focus of Foucault's historical analysis of madness. This rigid cellular arrangement functions as a disciplinary grid. It transforms the physical space into a tool for targeting, isolating, and observing bodies continuously. This photograph juxtaposes a patient's image with handwritten diagnoses. Foucault argued psychiatry didn't find mental illness hiding inside a pre-existing subject. Through documents like this, institutions created the mentally ill patient, fastening onto bodies and isolating gestures to constitute individuals requiring management. These institutions achieve control not primarily by chaining people to walls, but by defining an authoritative standard of health and actively forcing bodies to conform to it through relentless systematic observation. Power, in this view, is productive. Through systems of observation, diagnosis, and spatial control, it manufactures the modern subject from the ground up. Because they disagree on what creates the self, Sartre and Foucault disagree entirely on the greatest moral failure of human existence. For Sartre, the ultimate failure is bad faith. This is the act of lying to yourself about your own radical freedom by blaming your actions on mitigating circumstances, your social class, or how you were raised. Foucault identifies a completely different danger, normalization. This is the tragedy of accepting an institutional or scientific definition of your identity and internalizing it as absolute truth. This is why Foucault rejects Sartre's demand that we uncover an authentic self. To Foucault, the very desire to discover a hidden, true essence deep inside yourself plays perfectly into the hands of the medical and psychological institutions that invented that essence to categorize you. Any philosophical or psychological attempt to decode your true nature is therefore an exercise in subjugation. It binds you to the very systems of power that Foucault wants to expose. If the individual is merely an effect of historical power, it raises an obvious question. Is human agency impossible? Late in his life, Foucault developed the concept of subjugation. Because power requires a physical body to act upon and mold, that same body inherently becomes a site capable of resistance. Where there is power, there is friction. Their final ethical imperatives stand in direct opposition. Sartre demands a strict alignment with your authentic, pre-existing freedom. Foucault demands relentless creativity. Foucault's ethical practice involves actively refusing the identity that institutions have manufactured for us. He argued that we must treat our lives, our behaviors, and our bodies as a continuous work of art. True liberation is not found by unearthing a fixed human essence that was buried inside you all along. It is achieved by actively and endlessly reinventing the historical effect you have become.